In chapter 4, we're going to now start giving you Hebrew words. You're going to be starting to learn vocabulary. You're going to be starting to put these words together into sentences, and you're going to actually start translation. In order to do that, we need to give you an introduction to the components that make up simple sentences, nouns and verbs. So before we can begin, we need to introduce you to a concept called a root. By root, what we mean is that Hebrew words are formed on the basis of a three-consonant root that conveys the core of meaning. As you can see in the examples here, the root letters shin, mem, ayin are used to represent the concept of hearing. Using these letters, you can create a host of different words. And as you learn vocabulary throughout our lessons, try to make the associations that group these kinds of words together. The verb, the verbal idea, hearing, is at the core of what this word means, but you can create other concepts. A report is something heard. The thing that is heard is an object. Causing somebody to hear is a concept. All of them are rooted in the same core, and you take the verbal idea embedded in those three root letters, and you use it to create nouns, verbs, etc. So you're going to be looking for these as you go about the process of learning vocabulary and deciphering words in context. Now, in some cases, these letters will not always be visible. Now, that does not mean that they will all disappear. One or two of these letters may disappear for one reason or another based on peculiarities of pronunciation. Until we learn these concepts later in the course, every time you encounter a word that has a weak root, a letter that may drop or somehow be obscure, it will be flagged in the grammar, and you will have a gloss immediately beneath the word that explains that to you so that you can make these associations by just simply being exposed to the text. These will show you the kinds of things that can happen. For example, the verb natan, to give, can sometimes show up in the text as tain. Not all the letters are present. So we will flag that for you, and we will make sure that you know the connection between your vocabulary and the form on the page so that you can tell the difference. A verb like ra'ah, to see, can show up in the text as something like ra'u, and the hey at the end of the form that you learn in your vocabulary word won't be visible. And again, we will flag that for you so that using the root that is provided for you and the information that's visible on the page, you'll be able to figure out how you need to translate. Another example is the verb seem, to put or place, which can sometimes lose the yod so that it is not visible. So all of those will be flagged for you so that you don't run into any trouble. Hebrew words are unique in that you can add a lot of components to a Hebrew word. In English, we don't do this very often. We do it mostly with plurals. So for example, hill can become hills, patch becomes patches, ox becomes oxen. We have certain patterns that are used in order to establish plurality. We need to establish plurality in Hebrew as well, and like English, those endings will be added directly onto the word in order to create the resulting noun form. But Hebrew can add things onto its nouns that we cannot do in English. In English, these become elements that are comprised of separate words. So for example, gender, whether they're masculine or feminine, is something that we have to convey in English with a separate word. So oxen but I would have to say she oxen or male oxen, female oxen. I would have to designate it with an entirely separate word. In Hebrew, you can tell from the form of the word itself. The definite article the for us is an entirely different word, but in Hebrew, it is attached directly onto the noun. The prepositions to, in, from, etc. These are, again, words that for us have an individual identity. But in Hebrew, many prepositions can be attached directly onto a word. The conjunction. Remember, a conjunction links ideas in a sentence. Typically, we will describe it as the word and, but it could be contrast, but. It could be a consequence, then. How it's translated may vary in context, but its basic form is a link between two parts of the sentence. And in English, it is separate, but in Hebrew, it is again attached directly onto the word in question. And then lastly, possessive pronouns. Possessive pronouns like my book, his book, her book. Those possessive pronouns, again, for us, are separate entities. They have an individual existence in our mind. But when we see them in Hebrew, they are all going to be lumped together, all of those features, on a single Hebrew word. Now, that does not mean every Hebrew word has to have all of those elements, but each of those elements is a possibility that has to be factored into the interpretation of a particular word. So, for example, let's take the very simple word halom, dream. We're going to read about how Joseph has these dreams about his brothers. Halom is what the word means all by itself. This is one of your vocabulary words in chapter 4. If we add the ending ot, we make it plural. So during this chapter, as we learned gender and number endings, you're going to learn how to do this and how to recognize this. So as soon as we add this ending, halomot, it becomes dreams, plural. But I can also add a preposition onto the front. So you'll experience some simple prepositions in this chapter. In your vocabulary, you learned b, in, on, at, with. If I attach the preposition bait onto this word, I end up with bachalomot, and I now have the phrase in dreams. But let's take it a few steps further. I can add the conjunction onto the front. And, uvachalomot, and in dreams. And I can even add a suffix to the end, the av ending that indicates that it is his dreams rather than someone else's. So in this word, uvachalomotav, I have the expression, and in his dreams. I have to be able to pick those component parts out as I am reading Hebrew and be able to isolate them so that in my mind they create a mental picture with each of those parts fitting together appropriately in the sentence. So let's talk about each aspect of what I attach. First of all, let's talk about grammatical number. If I take the word day, I understand what I mean when I say that it is singular. When I do a plural, days, it makes sense. I know that I have more than one. Hebrew also has something we don't have in English called a dual. It's a separate ending when I specifically want to stress that there are only two of them. So I can express a day, I can express multiple days, or I can specifically say that there are 2 days. Those are examples where number conveys something that has physical reality for us. There are, however, what we call collective nouns. We have this in English as well. So in Hebrew, the word seed, you do not use the word seeds, plural, unless you're talking about different species. So if I plant a garden and I have carrots and peas and squash and corn, then I come home with seeds because I have different species of seeds. But most of the time, when I'm talking about opening up a package and dumping out the contents, I'm going to dump out seed. And it could be one, or it could be many. So it is a singular noun, and it has grammatical singularity, but it is not necessarily conceptually singular. So I have to distinguish between grammatical number and actual number. The same thing is true with abstract nouns. The word panim means face, and it may very well be that it has its origins in the different parts of the face, so that at some point in history, it perhaps had an element of plurality to it. But over the course of time, that is completely lost. It has the im ending, which is plural, that you are already familiar with from words like Elohim, cherubim. That im ending indicates a face, something that is singular. It is not plural. And you'll find this even with abstract nouns like youthfulness, neurim, never been conceived of as plural. It has grammatical plurality, but it has nothing to do with the way that it translates. So you're going to be learning the endings that are attached to these nouns that reflect the concept of grammatical number. What you do with that is going to be dictated by the context. You are in a cross-cultural experience. Granted, this is your first time into the Hebrew Bible, but as you look at it, as you read it, you are in a cross-cultural experience where people do not necessarily convey things the same way that you do in English. So you're going to look at the page. You're going to assess what is being meant. You will have to discern whether grammatical number is significant or not. In some cases, it will have grammatical plurality, but you won't reflect that in translation. In some cases, it will have no grammatical plurality, but you need to have it in English because of the way we speak. So that will be something that you'll become sensitive to in the context. Now, in addition to grammatical number, we also have to talk about grammatical gender, because in English, we have objects that have gender, and we have objects that are neutral. They have no gender. They're inanimate. And we distinguish that fairly clearly in the way that we talk about things, despite the fact that some of you have cars or trucks that you have given pet names because of how fond you are of them. There is physical gender, as in these two words, ish, man, and isha, woman. That is the typical pattern for masculine and feminine. However, there are other words that follow the same pattern, and that grammatical gender means absolutely nothing. It's just an alternate formation pattern. And we need some way to talk about them. So when we talk about them, we draw links between these inanimate objects that have no gender and the objects that do have gender. So ish, man, becomes kind of the prototype for what happens when we encounter nouns that have no ending. Nouns with no ending on them are typically identified as being masculine in form. Conversely, isha kind of becomes a prototype, and the ah ending becomes the typical way of looking at feminine gender. So if you have a noun that has an ah ending and follows that pattern, it is said to have feminine gender, even if it has no gender in English. So it becomes grammatical gender. Keep in mind that grammatical gender is something that also has exceptions. These principles are meant to guide you over the course of everything that you examine, and there will always be exceptions. You will find some words that have no "ah" ending and yet are identified as being feminine. The reason for that is that when they show up in the Hebrew Bible, anytime they are described, they use feminine verbs and they use feminine adjectives. And so they will be listed in your vocabulary as being feminine in gender. Now, most of the time, what you can do is you can look at the word in your dictionary or in your vocabulary word, and you can say, it has no ending. It is a masculine word, and they won't bother even telling you that on the vocabulary card because it's evident to you. If it has an "ah" ending, you'll assume that it is feminine. But if there is an exception, if there is a word that is typically going to be associated with a gender that it doesn't look like it should be associated with, the vocabulary card will flag this for you so that you will be able to make the appropriate word associations when you get into the text. You should also understand that masculine is the default gender. Now, this is pretty typical for languages in general. In our politically correct era, we're getting much more sensitive to making sure that we distinguish feminine and masculine when we mean that. But in most languages, as in Older English, the tendency is to use masculine when you have any kind of a mixed crowd. Masculine becomes the default gender. And sometimes in passages, you may find a masculine form when it's clearly feminine and all of the constituents are feminine, but it simply is the more common form, and so in expressions, they just drop into what's familiar. So you understand now what we're talking about in terms of gender and number. Conceptually, we're talking about endings that signal to you singularity versus plurality, feminine versus masculine. The question now is, how is that conveyed? What do they look like? So as you can see from this chart, we have two boxes. We have masculine and feminine, and we have the singular, plural, and dual categories listed on the left-hand side of the page. For the purposes of illustration, I have put 3 boxes to represent any 3-consonant root. The reason that I'm doing this is because I want you to focus on the ending. You can put these endings on any word you want. So I want you to have that ending jump off the page at you so that you see the word, you see the ending, you put them together, you have meaning. But sometimes it's helpful to see it on an actual Hebrew word, and so immediately next to that, I have included the word sus, horse. It is a word that has no potential for alteration in its sounds. As a result, it will always keep the same form through all of these examples so that you should still be able to focus in on the suffix itself. So if you're dealing with a singular masculine object, there is no ending. Just as sus, horse, has no ending. It's actually a male horse. I shouldn't just say horse in English. I should be designating it as a male horse. If I want to designate it as feminine, I add the "ah" ending, as you can see here. On the word sus, that then becomes susa, and a susa is a mare. The gender is designated by the ending. Both of those are singulars. Plural, the masculine plural is indicated with the im ending that you're already familiar with from Elohim, cherubim, seraphim. The im ending tells you masculine plural or a group in which males and females are included. So if I say susim, I'm talking about horses. Could be all male, it could be mixed gender. But if I say susot and add the ot ending, I am specifically talking about female horses, and this is my plural ending. Now that's kind of the gamut of what we have in English, but as I said earlier, Hebrew has another ending called a dual when it specifically wants to specify that there's only two. And it is the ending ayim. So if we add this ending onto the word horse, we end up with susayim. And susayim would be a pair of horses. If we take that same ending, ayim, and add it to not susa, but add it to susat, the old feminine ending, we end up with a feminine dual. So susatayim becomes two mares. And this table represents all of the endings that designate gender and number for Hebrew nouns. With those endings in mind, what else can we add onto a Hebrew noun? The definite article is one of the most common. By the definite article, we mean that we're specifying some object in distinction from the general population of similar objects. So books, many books, the book. So I have specified, that's the definite article. Now in Hebrew, definiteness is expressed similarly to in English, but there is an important distinction. As you can see in these two examples, I have the word ish, man, and ha-ish, the man. These two become a nice representation for the spectrum that you can experience in English translation. The first one actually covers two categories. In Hebrew, when I say ish, I could mean mankind as a generic entity. Or, since Hebrew has no indefinite article, I could in English express this as a unspecified man. So the word without any marking for definiteness can actually fulfill two categories in English: generic and indefinite. The definite article overlaps the same as in English: ha-ish, the man, and in English, the man. So that's kind of the layout of how these things overlap. The thing that you have to keep in mind again is that we're again in this cross-cultural kind of context. What you do in English does not necessarily transfer over well into what you find in Hebrew. Try to think in terms of the Hebrew text. Try to understand what the author is saying. Figure out how it is best to be expressed. Now, at a beginning stage, you will make some mistakes in that, and we will correct you. But your exposure to Hebrew is going to make you more and more adept to that. And if you have that skill set to think in terms of the transmission of expression from one language to another, you're going to be a long ways along the path in terms of becoming adept at translating Hebrew. For example, here's a passage from 2 Chronicles where it says, Asa did what was the good in the eyes of the Lord his God. Now, we don't say it like that. We don't say the good. In the text, what the author was trying to convey is that this is that category of things that are pleasing to God. We leave out the definite article. We just say Asa did what was good in the eyes of the Lord. In another example, in Joshua chapter 22, the people are told, the day you have turned from the Lord. Again, great Hebrew expression, but not a very good English expression. If we're talking about a specific day, what day are we talking about? Today. This day you have turned from the Lord. Understanding function and the way in which it's expressed is going to be important for you being able to bridge the gap between the Hebrew approach to things and the English approach. So that's how the definite article functions. That's how it overlaps with English. Those are the kinds of things you need to keep in mind. What do they look like? The standard form of the definite article is a he, patach, short a, and a dagesh, doubling of the next consonant. He, patach, doubling. This needs to become familiar to you because there are other reasons why you would put a he at the front of a word. We won't get these for a while, but you need to become sufficiently comfortable with the definite article so that when you encounter the other forms, you can actually distinguish between them. So, he, patach, doubling, definite article, standard form. Now let me go back to chapter 3 for a moment and refresh your mind with that one principle that we kept reiterating as being central to understanding how Hebrew pronounces words and how it works. Closed, unaccented syllables take short vowels. Okay? So when we look at this word, you have a patach under the he. It is a short vowel. It is unaccented. We know why the doubling dot has to be present in the first letter of that word. It has to create a stable, closed, unaccented syllable. So, you will appreciate what happens when you encounter a guttural. I told you in chapters 1 and 2 that gutturals are unique because they do not allow for doubling. You still have to keep the syllables stable. So what has to happen in order to create the same syllable structure, stability in pronunciation? You're going to have a long vowel instead of a short vowel so that the syllables stay the same, but you can somehow compensate for the lack of doubling. So if we have a word like ish, man, that starts with an aleph that can't double, I have to have a comets under the he, ha-ish. You can memorize that if you want, but if you understand that closed, unaccented syllables take short vowels, you should be able to intuit that from the standard form. Now, the next example, you perhaps couldn't intuit from what we already told you, but if you add another component, you should be able to. He and chet, the H consonants, have a tendency to be stronger than aleph and ayin. So the H consonants, he and chet, the definite article is pointed exactly as you would expect. They simply cannot double. Somehow these letters are strong enough that they don't require that you compensate by lengthening the vowel. You'll see them in the form that you see here with a patach, almost as if it was a standard form. In fact, they often refer to this as implicit doubling. You can't see it, but it's implicitly doubled because of the weight of those letters. And then lastly, on occasion, you will run across the definite article with a segol, as in he-afar. Now, at this stage, you're probably going to be satisfied with simply saying, oh, when I see he with segol at the beginning of a word, it's okay that that be the definite article, and you can translate it accordingly. Trying to process through this information takes time, and it takes exposure. And this particular vocalization of the definite article is fairly rare in comparison to the other three. So you won't encounter it as often. So this chart is kind of the one to start to work from. Standard form, he, patach, doubling dot. If it's a guttural, you'll usually compensate for the lack of the dagesh by lengthening the vowel. Keep the syllable structure. If it's an H consonant, patach just stays there, just don't bother, and then sometimes you'll see the segol. I'm going to explain to you, though, why those in the fourth category occur so that you've been exposed to it and you can come back to this to refresh yourself as we move on, because it will eventually become important. So try to assimilate as much of it as you can. The letters ayin, he, and chet, when they have a comets, long a, don't like to have a together. There's a pronunciation issue. It has to do with slang. It has to do with smoothing things out. So what you'll discover is that they will tend to adjust the vowel depending on how the word is accented. So as you can see in these two examples, two pairs of examples here, the examples on the left are where the accented syllable is immediately after the definite article, as in the word ha'az, the strong one. Because those words are, or those components are so closely bound together, the vowels like to be the same, ha'az. Same in the next word, hahar, the mountain. The accented syllable is so close to the definite article that they like to be the same. But as soon as you elongate that word out, the repetition of the same vowel is going to be less comfortable. So when you get words like he'afar, the dust, the distance from the accent is going to cause you to see this sigol. And that is the same kind of principle that you see with the he and with hate. Hate just likes to have the sigol anyway. So you'll see forms like hechayel, where the two syllables are closely accented. The hate prefers the sigol. And then you'll also see it with longer words like hechakam. They always use the sigol. So those are the exceptions that make up that fourth category. It has everything to do with syllabification, where the accent is. And for now, I would focus on the four simple principles as I initially expressed them. Another component that you can add onto Hebrew nouns is the conjunction. In your vocabulary card, again, it's defined as but, then, and. As you can see from the examples here in this chart, I have again used the three consonants to represent any Hebrew word, any Hebrew root, any Hebrew word. And we're specifically selecting examples that can illustrate each type so that you also see it in a tangible form with an actual Hebrew word. The standard form of the definite article is a schwa. That is because the vav that you put on to indicate and is technically all by itself. It has no vowel anyway. So when you attach it onto a word, most of the time you put it on without a vowel, and no vowel is designated with a schwa. So the standard form is vav with schwa on the front of a word. In this case, ve shalom, and peace. Now, for pronunciation's sake, there are difficulties that arise when you're trying to move sounds around in your mouth. And the most common principle that you'll need to remember with the conjunction is what we call the bump schwa rule. By bump schwa, what we mean is bump, B-U-M-P. The consonants are B-M-P, bait, mem, and pay, bump. Schwa, any consonant with a schwa. Bait, mem, pay, and any consonant with a schwa will always use the oo vocalization of the conjunction instead of the standard. So the bump schwa rule implies that if your word starts with a bait, the conjunction needs to be oo, as in the word beit, house, like Beit Lechem, Bethlehem. So uvet is the way that you would pronounce that. Now, it's more than just a rule. Again, we want you to feel Hebrew. We want you to engage Hebrew as a living language. It is hard to get from v, where I'm v, m, or v, b, v, p. It's hard to make that transition rapidly. So in order to facilitate it, they are choosing a vocalization that is closer to the pronunciation of bait, mem, and pay. And they are all produced with the lips. B, m, p. So, oo, which is the vowel closest to the front of the mouth, makes a very convenient transition from the conjunction into the consonant. So I say uvet. If I have a word like makom, starts with a mem, I say makom. If I have a word like pen, ufen. Or if I have a word with a schwa, I don't say v'sh, muel. I can't have three consonants in a row without vowels. So they use the u to help transition into the word. So Shemuel, Samuel, Ushemuel, and Samuel. Those are the two most common rules. Standard form, vav with schwa. Bump schwa, bait, mem, pe, consonants with schwa, use u. Bump schwa rule. What happens if your word begins with a composite schwa? That makes it a little more awkward. I can't use the bump schwa rule because it makes it awkward to go from u to ah immediately with a guttural. So if you have a composite schwa, what they will do is they will match the vowel. So for example, in the word ani, I, we have an A-class composite schwa. We match the vowel of the conjunction to the vowel that is in the composite schwa and create a nice, smooth transition into the word, va'ani. If we have a word like Edom, Edom, we match the vowel, the short E, for the conjunction so that we now say ve'edom. If we have a word like choli, where the chet has the short O composite schwa, we match the vowel so that we have a smooth transition, vochli. So by matching, we're able to create a nice, clean transition in sound. You can see that these are more than just rules. They're just the natural principles that come from sound. There are some letters with schwa, however, in which the bump schwa rule or the composite schwa rule are not going to work. And that is the words that begin with the letter yod that has no vowel. This is a great example. We take the word Yehudah, Judah. Yehudah, if we put the conjunction on it with a regular schwa, we have a sincere problem. We have a vav with no vowels, we have a yod with no vowels, and we have a hey before we get to any vowel that will enable us to articulate this word. It's impossible to pronounce, so we have to do something. We need a vowel sound with the conjunction, just like we did in the earlier examples. But yod doesn't have affinity with most of those vowels. U, y doesn't go together. Ui. We don't do I. We don't do a. We don't do oi. We need a vowel that has affinity with the yod. So as a result, what they will do is give it a hirik, an I vowel that has close affinity to the yod, E. Now you can think of this as dropping a dot. Some people talk about having a schwa fight. When you have a schwa fight, one of them is going to lose an I. Gets a dot dropped out of it. And as a result, it gives you a form like you see here in stage 2, Vihuda. Now, notice that the yod is vowelless. You can't even hear it when I pronounce that word, Vihuda. The transition from silent schwa after the yod to the hey makes it impossible to hear the yod anyway. And so the yod is actually going to do what we call quiesce. It becomes quiet. And it actually merges with the vowel so that what you see is this, Vihuda. No schwa. The yod has become a vowel marker. And while this is easy to pronounce, and you'll still recognize that the vav is the conjunction and, what we need you to realize is that is not the common vowel that you use for the conjunction. When that happens, you need to know that the yod that comes next is part of the word that follows. So, cover up the conjunction, Look at what remains so that you can make the connection with your words that you have memorized. In this case, you want to make a connection with Yehudah, Judah. You don't want to try and figure out who Huda is. You don't know who Huda is, neither do I. You want to be able to recognize its connection to your vocabulary. There are also a few other cases, and we're not introducing these so that you memorize them so that you can produce them, but we are introducing them so that you can become familiar with them as you encounter them. The first is the conjunction immediately before the accent. Sometimes the conjunction will have a comets, and you actually have this in your Genesis 1 through 5 reading that you do each day. In the second verse, it says, V'ha'aretz hayata tohu va'vohu, formless and void. It's not tohu v'vohu, it's tohu va'vohu. And because of where the accent is and because of how closely those words are joined together, they sometimes use the comets vowel to link these closely associated words. That is not odd. You're not missing something. It's just simply part of what goes on in the language. The last set of exceptions happens with divine name. Words like Elohim and Adonai have a tendency to be pronounced slightly differently because of the character of Aleph. When we were going through the alphabet, I mentioned to you that the guttural letters, particularly Aleph, are letters that you can't hear very well. Well, Aleph, since it is silent anyway, has a tendency sometimes to completely lose its consonantal value and to not be heard at all. So if you take a word like Elohim, for example, when it stands on its own, it starts out with a composite schwa, Elohim. Remember, a schwa is a schwa is a schwa. It's a vowel-less aleph. The only reason it has that composite schwa there when the word stands by itself is so that you can hear the transition from aleph to lamed, Elohim. When I put the conjunction on the front, I put the vav, and I match the vowels because I can't have too many vowel-less consonants at the front of the word. But when I do that, it's hard to hear Ve'elohim and still hear the aleph. So the form that you will actually see is represented here in the box to the right, where you instead see Ve'elohim. Aleph has no vowel dots. It's there so that you recognize its historic form. It's there so that you recognize the word, but it is not pronounced. As long as you're focused on pronunciation and you read what's there on the page, you'll pronounce it correctly. And you shouldn't have any problem recognizing that it comes from Elohim because of the letters that are there. The word Adonai is similar. So when we say Adonai, the aleph has a composite schwa with a patach, with an A-class vowel. When we put the conjunction on, we end up with two vowel-less consonants in a row at the front of a word. Doesn't work. So we use the composite schwa rule. We match the vowel and the conjunction to the composite schwa. And we hypothetically come up with Va Adonai. Now, like Elohim, the aleph quiesces. It becomes quiet. You don't hear it anymore. So the form that you will see in the text is once again in the box to the right. Vadonai. Vadonai. You're only going to see the patach under the conjunction, and the aleph no longer has any vowel pointing. It's not going to be pronounced. That's what you will see. That is also what you will see then on God's personal name, the Tetragrammaton, when it is written in the text. Because remember, when they read the Tetragrammaton, they read the vocalization of Adonai. So it will have to have the same form as the word that you see immediately above it. So Those are the building blocks that we have when we're working with Hebrew nouns. We understand gender and number. We've seen what the gender and number endings look like. You need to know these. You need to learn them well. We've also seen how the definite article works and how the definite article is added on to Hebrew nouns. You need to learn the basic vocalizations of the definite article so that you can recognize it and have it jump off the page at you. You want to be able to distinguish between the and the word. What happens if the is followed by a word that starts with a hey? You want to be able to tell the difference. Let those pieces come off the page at you because you know them well. And then also the vav at the front of any word is always the conjunction and. And as we've gone through the principle for the conjunction, you've seen how it is to be pronounced as you're trying to read through the text. You have what you need for nouns as we finish out this portion of the chapter. Before we can move into the actual translations, I need to give you a few verbs. It's impossible to create sentences without some kind of verb form. So we need to talk about basic verb formation. We'll be developing this later in the grammar, but these basic principles will allow you to translate from the very beginning with sentences that are rather elaborate. Basic verb formation can begin to be understood by looking at your vocabulary card. So, for example, the verb shamar on your vocabulary card has the Hebrew word on one side. On the back side, it has the definition to keep or guard. That word is a Hebrew root. But you remember that when we talked about Hebrew roots are technically the three consonants that make up the core of meaning: keeping, guarding. This form is actually the simplest verb form available so that you can actually pronounce it to memorize it. And it happens to be a verb that doesn't mean to keep or guard. It actually means he kept. We give it a generic definition so that you can use that as a memory device for memorizing the basic meaning of the word. So in context, you could have a sentence like this: Shamar et Hatzon. He kept the flock. You don't translate to keep like you have on your card. You need to understand that these three consonants with those vowels communicate a certain person. They communicate a certain idea in terms of tense as well. So we need to give you a few basic verbs to start with. Most sentences are going to focus in on discussions about items that are outside an immediate conversation. So imagine that I am talking to you. I is first person. I, we, us. I talk to you and you all about this concept. And what we talk about, he, she, it, them, are going to be the kinds of verbs that are most common in any kind of discourse. The one-on-one conversation, first person to second person, is more rare. It requires direct speech. So most of our translation exercises can focus on a few simple verb forms, and we can lay the groundwork for being able to forge ahead. So we're going to give you two types of verbs, and we're going to focus on third person: he, she, and they. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see what we call the perfects. Until we get to the perfects, we are going to basically treat these as past tense verbs. We'll have a more precise definition, but for now, these are going to be translated as past tense. And you'll notice that they change in form slightly to indicate who is doing the action. So, shamar, he kept. Shamara, she kept. Shamaru, they kept. Now, the ending on the feminine shouldn't bother you. You've already seen it on nouns. So you're taking the same principle, you're applying it to verbs, and should be recognizable. The "u" ending in Hebrew is always plural. It's always masculine. So this is a generic they did this. So shamar, shamara, shamaru. These are your three basic forms. We're also going to use what is called an imperfect. Now think of it this way: perfect, completed, imperfect, incompleted. So your perfects are going to tend to be completed, past action. Imperfects are going to tend to be incomplete, present or future action. And these forms are formed not by adding endings to the word, but by adding prefixes to the word. We actually call them performatives because they're part of the form of the word and they're on the front. These will be conjugated in this fashion: yishmor, tishmor, and yishmaru. Yishmor, the yod tells you it's masculine. So he will keep, or he is keeping, present or future. Tishmor, she is keeping, or she will keep. Now keep in mind that in Hebrew, gender does not necessarily indicate physical gender. So masculine and feminine can refer to objects. Okay? So he or it will keep. She or it will keep. And then yishmaru is masculine plural. Remember, u ending, I said a moment ago, is always masculine, always plural. You'll notice too that it has a yod at the front, just like the masculine singular he. Yishmaru means them all guys will keep. Yishmor, tishmor, yishmaru. 6 forms. Those are the forms that we're going to use in our translations and will stand us in very good stead for quite some time until we can get to a more formal introduction to the verb. Now, when you take each of those sets of verbs, you can either have them stand by themselves or you can connect them to the conjunction and. And as you can see from this diagram, you can have what we call a simple conjunction, meaning I'm just simply adding and onto the meaning of the word. So shamar, he kept, veshamar, and he kept. That's pretty intuitive. Hebrew also has something, however, where when you put the conjunction on a perfect, it makes it present future tense. Now, we'll explain why later. It just is. So veshamar can also mean and he will keep. Now, that's a little bit too much confusion for right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to cross out the center category. It is relatively rare to find a perfect with a conjunction when it is simply the and, just the simple conjunction attached onto the past tense meaning. So we can cross out the whole center category of this type of verbs, and we can expand your verbal usage, keeping the same 3 basic forms to cover both past tense and future. So past tense, when the perfect is by itself: shamar, he kept; shamara, she kept; shamaru, they kept. With the conjunction, any perfect will become present or future. Veshamar, and he will keep. Veshamara, and she will keep. Veshamaru, and they will keep. With the imperfects, it's a little simpler. We still have the 3 same categories of meaning, but in this case, each one has a slightly different form, so you can always tell them apart. Yishmor, he will keep. Simple conjunction, v'yishmor, just like we talked about with the conjunction, and he will keep. If, however, the conjunction has the patach and doubling dot, vayishmor, it is a past tense Hebrew verb used for telling stories. That form needs to be translated as past tense. Now notice the form of the verbs has not changed. We're still using only 3 basic forms. We're just allowing each set of 3 to cover the gamut of both past tense, present tense, and future tense. Since there's a clear distinction, we will use all 3 of these forms in the imperfect. And that's going to allow us to give you a fairly extensive exposure to Hebrew sentences. So memorize those 6 forms and understand what you do as you translate them when they're connected to the conjunction. Now, when you take those verbs and put them together with the nouns that we just talked about, what are you going to experience in a Hebrew sentence? Well, you might be able to guess from the description that we just had about the verbs with the conjunction attached to them that Hebrew likes to put the verbs first. In English, we always put the subject first. He kept the flock. But keep in mind that in Hebrew, the verb has the subject embedded in it. Shamar is he kept. All of that information is placed at the front of the sentence. So if we take a sentence like Vayishmor Yosef son, as you can see in the first word, we're dealing with an imperfect. It has the special conjunction that indicates past tense. I would translate that, and he kept, all conveyed from that one word. Hebrew then likes to put the subject if it needs to clarify who it is. And he kept, namely, Joseph, and then you get the direct object, son. He kept sheep. Vayishmor Yosef son. And he kept, namely Joseph, sheep. And we would paraphrase that then into good English, and Joseph kept sheep. You don't have to stick to the Hebrew word order in order to capture what's there in Hebrew. English requires it done differently. Now, that's the standard Hebrew word order. Verb, then subject, then the object that is directly impacted by the action. But there are times where they may change the word order around in order to reshape focus. We call this fronting. So for example, in the passage that you're reading from Genesis 1 through 5, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. Notice, veha'aretz hayata tohu vavohu. The word earth is put first, not the verb. Earth is put first. It fronts it. Why is it doing this? It's because it is shifting your focus from the storyline, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Oh, by the way, the earth was formless and void. And darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the breath of God was hovering over the waters. Now, back to the story. And God said, let there be light. So there's a standard Hebrew word order, but then there are reasons why they shift that in order to signal things for you in the narrative. It also helps to create contrast. So for example, in that same passage, as we move down to verse 5, it says, and God called the light day. Notice that the word day, yom, is at the end of that first line. God called the light day. Velachoshek, and to the darkness, he called night. For the sake of contrast, they haven't put the verb first. They've put the darkness so that they can juxtapose light and day against darkness and night. So fronting can be used in order to help create a sense of tone. It's like you're not just seeing words on a page that are flatlined. You're actually hearing the inflection of the voice as it's reflected in the sequence in which the words are put on the page. So you have an introduction to some basic verb forms, and you understand the basic sentence as it is expressed in Hebrew. And now you'll get an opportunity to put that into practice with some translations exercises.